Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Evelyn Goh, and I am the Shedden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies at the Australian National University, where we're hosting this webinar. I would like to begin with an important convention that we observe here, by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we meet. The ANU is located in the Australian Capital Territory, and the traditional custodians of our land are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. So we acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of the city and its region. Welcome to the 7th and the penultimate event in our Women in Asian Security Research seminar series. To our live audience, it's lovely to see you, and to those of you who will be tuning in later to view our recording, greetings, and we hope to be able to engage with you live in our next seminar. Our aim in this series is to showcase the cutting-edge academic research of women in the fields of Asia-Pacific security, broadly defined, and it is targeted at international scholarly communities working on this important region. So this series comprises interactive webinars, virtual research seminars, and online book clubs, as those of you who've stayed with us throughout the series will know. You will be able to find our seminar schedule, etc., on our website, and we will put the link up on the chat box in a couple of minutes. Let me move on now to introduce our speaker in this 7th event of the series. We're delighted to have Ms. Kyuri Park with us today, and who's going to speak to us about her working paper. Kyuri is a PhD candidate in political science and international relations at the University of Southern California. Her dissertation examines variations in patterns of security cooperation in the Asia Pacific over time, and she uses network analysis and case studies to do that, as you will hear. She also does research on South Korea's middle power foreign policy. Kyuri completed an MA in Asian Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And she also holds a BA in International Relations from Ewha Women's University in South Korea. Previously, she's been a US Asia Grand Strategy postdoctoral fellow at the USC Korean Studies Institute. And she's also been a contributing author of Korea-Japan Relations for Pacific Forum CSIS's Comparative Connections publication, with which many of us will be familiar. Now, Kyuri is going to talk to us today about her paper entitled The Evolution of an Asia-Pacific Security Cooperation Network. And she's going to focus on the issue of the growing incidence of joint military exercises involving China. We're going to proceed in the following way. Kyuri is going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. She also has slides to accompany this, and then we'll spend the rest of the time that we've got on a discussion and question and answer session. If you've got ideas and questions as Kyuri is speaking, may I encourage you to put the short version of your question or comment into the chat box, and once she's done, I will help to facilitate the question and answer session. So it does help me quite a lot if you can put a small, short indication of what your question is within that, and then I can call upon you to elaborate on that question during the Q&A sessions. So thank you very much for that, and I'm going to turn over to Kyuri now for her to speak to us. Again, to remind you to assist with the stability of the internet connection and the soundness of the recording, please can I ask participants to turn off your video and audio as I turn over to Kyuri now. Thank you so much. Kyuri, over to you.
Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Goh. So before anything else, let me just start by sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see my slides? Yes, okay. Okay. So good morning and good evening, everyone, as Professor Go said, depending on where you are. And thank you for having me here today. It is good to see some familiar faces and also new faces in the audience today. So today I'll talk to you about my research project on the evolution of security cooperation network in the Asia Pacific. Today, I'll structure my talk based on the following order. And as you can see from the outline, before jumping into the substance of my research, I would like to start by giving a bit of context where my research puzzle is coming from and why this matters. So along with the rise of China, many scholars have described or ventured prediction on this new regional order that is emerging in Asia. And the conventional wisdom in the field is that the region is increasingly characterized by dual order. And according to the dual order thesis, China is now very much within the economic order, as many Asia Pacific countries are tied to China for trade, investment, and market. However, when it comes to security, China still remains outside the security order, as many regional countries rely on the United States for security. Calling it Asia's paradox, some scholars even argue, while economic Asia is characterized by increasing cooperation with China, security Asia is still dominated by heightened arms race in response to rising China. However, is it true that economic and security spheres of the Asia Pacific are onto very different trajectories? Is it true that the security cooperation network in the Asia Pacific remains fragmented despite high economic integration in the region? I believe that the underlying assumption of the dual order thesis, or Asia's paradox, is that there is no spillover effect of cooperation from economic domain to security domain in Asia. However, I would like to highlight one thing. From early 2000s, China has become the largest trading partner and largest source of foreign tourists for most of the countries in the region. Then given such high economic integration with China, I believe that it is worth questioning there is no development of security ties between China and regional countries. So from such background, with the aim of making contribution to the debate on the regional order, in my research, I asked, how and why has the pattern of security cooperation changed in the Asia Pacific over time? In my talk today, I'll majorly focus on the first part of my project where I explore the question of how. So indeed, seen through the lens of former alliances, there are no significant changes in the security ties in the Asia Pacific since the end of World War II. While China does not have security ties with regional countries, the hub and spoke system of bilateral alliances led by the United States seems to be the archetype of security cooperation in the region. From such background, a lot of existing literatures questioned or provided explanation on why there is no NATO in Asia or why there is no security architecture beyond hub and spokes. However, is this accurate and full representation of security cooperation dynamics in Asia today? Thus, the security cooperation network in the Asia remains highly centralized and sparsely connected. In my research, I argue that there is no Asia's paradox. I argue security ties in the region are interconnected as much as economic ties in Asia today. Over time, security ties in the Asia Pacific has evolved to an inclusive and densely connected network. In this network, I argue that the US allies and strategic partners in the region expanded security cooperation with China. Then how did I come to this conclusion? I believe that we have missed this pattern of cooperation that is emerging in Asia because existing literatures haven't systematically examined other measures of security cooperation in Asia. Increasingly, Asia-Pacific countries, including China, carry out security cooperation with each other through diverse channels. And this is happening despite the absence of formal alliance ties. Growing security cooperation in the region include neighbor port visits, military education exchange, joint military exercises, establishment of military communication hotlines, and high-level defense meetings. Among the list of measures of security cooperation, in my research, I looked at joint military exercises in the region, largely due to two reasons. First, joint military exercise is a long-standing and iterated practices of security cooperation. I believe that the starting of joint military exercises in Asia goes all the way back to when the alliances were first created in the region. And often, these exercises are conducted on a regular basis, either annually or biannually. And I believe that such long history and iterated practices of joint military exercise allow us to trace the changes in security ties between countries over time. Second, different from other cheap talks on cooperation, joint military exercise is a costly signal of security cooperation. And as the saying goes, like, actions speak louder than the words. The cost of participating in joint military exercise is actually quite high for countries in terms of extra financial cost and diplomatic cost. So, for instance, when South Korea conducts joint maritime exercise with the United States, Seoul has to bear not only the financial cost of mobilizing a navy and fueling the ship, but also the diplomatic cost of risking the relations with China and North Korea to a certain extent. It is because often Beijing and Pyongyang express their dissatisfaction or concern about joint military exercise between United States and South Korea. In other words, joint military exercise create cost and risk that actors who are not committed for cooperation might not be willing to suffer. From such background, I believe that participation in joint military exercise is a type of costly signal that reveals a state's actual willingness and ability to coordinate military and respond to crisis together with the other participants of the exercise. For analysis, I primarily employed the network analysis. Network analysis is a suitable method for analyzing relational data like security ties. Also, this method is suitable for disclosing patterns in complex social structures where country dyads are not isolated bubbles, but a part of a complex system of interdependence. To talk about my empirical contribution to the field, in the existing IR literature, there is dearth of systematic data on security cooperation in the Asia Pacific. And especially this is the case for China's security cooperation with the region. Filling in the gap in the literature, in my research, I constructed a unique data set on joint military exercises in the Asia Pacific from 1970 to 2019. The data set records 1,447 exercises between 11 major countries in the region. And I marked the countries that is included in my data set in green on the map that you can see on the screen. I have set the time frame to start from 1970s because this is when many regional countries started to normalize their diplomatic relations. And I believe that normalized diplomatic relations is the prerequisite condition for any type of interstate cooperation to take place. For data collection, I primarily employed web scraping of news articles for joint military exercises that took place in the last 20 years. And for earlier timeframes, sometime between 1970 and 1999, I collected the data by compiling and updating the existing data sets on joint military exercises. The types of exercises included in my data set ranges from combat exercise to training on counterterrorism and disaster relief. I'm happy to talk more about the data set and the method later if you have any questions. Then what does the joint military exercise data tell us about the pattern of security cooperation in the Asia Pacific? I have a graph to show you. So here the red line refers to the number of joint military exercises that China conducted with Asia Pacific countries in the past 5 decades. As you can see from the flat line on your left, up until the 1990s, China had no joint military exercise with any Asia-Pacific countries. However, after the 2000s, we observe an upward trend. In the 2000s, China conducted 23 exercises with the region. And from 2010 to 2019, recording approximately 360% increase from the previous decade, the number of exercises between China and regional countries jumped up to 117. I believe that this is an enduring and overlooked trend in the region. Moreover, it is worth highlighting, over the last 20 years, the US allies and strategic partners in the region who would be least likely to engage in security cooperation with China have expanded joint military exercise with Beijing. Out of 121 exercises that China conducted with the regional countries, 57% of the exercises involved US allies in the region. Also, considering that many countries in the non-US ally group, such as Singapore, are also important strategic partners of the United States, China's expanding engagement with the region is quite significant. Furthermore, I'd like to note, in terms of the types of exercise, 47% of the exercises between China and the regional countries involved joint training of navies and marines. This new development after the 2000s is especially noteworthy because it came against the backdrop of regional countries' ongoing tension with China in the South China Sea over territories and maritime borders. I believe that the results suggest that despite ongoing tension with China, the regional countries have made effort to build confidence and reduce the risk of miscalculation by working together with China. Then how has the development of new security ties changed security cooperation network in the Asia Pacific? I have a short video clip to show you. I'd like to direct your attention to this video clip that summarizes my key finding on the dynamic evolution of security cooperation network over time. So before playing the video clip, let me clarify a few things. Here in the network, each node refers to a country in the Asia Pacific, and the links between countries refer to the number or the presence of joint military exercises between the dyad. The red node refers to China, blue node is the United States, and I marked the rest of the countries in the beige color. So let me start playing the video. So did you notice the changes? So it's too bad that I can't see some of you nodding your head or like getting the reaction from the
It'll be hard not to notice. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I got some feedback. Yeah, thank you for the cooperative.
This is really effective.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So the visualization of the joint military exercise network suggests that the region has gradually moved away from the strict hub and spoke structure and evolved to a multinodal meshed network that is densely connected, less centralized, and inclusive over time. For further analysis, I have broken down the evolution of security cooperation network into 4 stages. So starting from the left side of your screen, indeed in the 1970s, the joint military exercise network looked like hub and spoke structure of alliances. The 1970s network was highly centralized in the sense that the US allies in Asia, also known as the US spokes, had no other joint military exercise partner other than the United States, and they were only indirectly connected to each other through the hub. Also, the network was sparsely connected in the sense that many countries in the region, including China, Thailand, and Singapore, were completely disconnected from the network and remained as isolates. However, gradually over time, the Joint Military Exercise Network has moved beyond hub and spoke structure. In the 1980s and 1990s, the network became more cohesive and interconnected as the US allies and strategic partners in the region carry out joint military exercise with each other. But the development of new security ties in this period reflected the Cold War ideological divide because China and Vietnam, the communist countries, remained outside a security cooperation network and did not have any joint military exercise with regional countries. However, after the 2000s, we start to see some changes. After the 2000s, the Joint Military Exercise Network of the Asia Pacific evolved to a new structure, which I call it as multilateral meshed network, which is inclusive and densely connected. A noticeable development in this period is definitely the inclusion of China in the network. I'd like to direct your attention to the red node and its links. China established direct security ties with all 10 Asia Pacific countries in the network. To provide support on my analysis based on the visualization of the network, I would like to talk about numbers a little bit. Here, I would like to talk about three major characteristics of the Joint Military Exercise Network by using network analysis indicators. So first, density. Density refers to the overall level of connectedness in a network, and it ranges between 0 and 1. In the 1970s, indicating that the connectedness in the network was very low, the density of the 1970s network was close to 0. However, the density gradually increased over time and reached 1 after the 2000s. And density of 1 indicates that all the Asia Pacific countries have developed direct security ties to every other country in the network. Second, centralization. Centralization refers to the degree a network ties are focused on one or few countries in the network, and it also ranges between 0 and 1. Suggesting that the network has become more decentralized over time, the network centralization score dropped continuously and reached 0 after the 2000s. The result reveals that security ties in Asia today are not concentrated on a single country, and the network has much more diffuse power and control structure. Third, transitivity. Transitivity refers to the tendency of the countries in the network to cluster together, and it also ranges between 0 and 1. And colloquially, it is also known as the probability that the friend of my friend is my friend in a network. Network with high transitivity is often considered cohesive because it means that the countries in the network have high tendency to cluster together and form communities. The transitivity of the Joint Military Exercise Network, which was close to 0 in the 1970s, increased to 1 after the 2000s. I believe that the result implies that the tendency to build security communities in the Asia Pacific has increased over time. Furthermore, last but not least, I would like to talk about the changes in China's position in the network. According to the hub centrality analysis, which measures the level of influence that a country has within a network, with hub score of 1, the United States has been the most central actor in the network since the 1970s, and that remains unchanged. However, it is noteworthy that China's influence in the security cooperation network has increased over the last 20 years as Beijing moved away from the periphery of the network by expanding joint military exercises with the region. Then actually, the next question that really begs an answer is, why do we observe increasing security cooperation with China in the region after the 2000s? So as I move forward with the project, I try to address the question of why. And one of the explanations is the change in China's, one of the explanations that we can consider is the change in China's grand strategy. So historically, the Chinese government strongly maintained the principle of non-alignment in the security realm. However, after the 2000s, China adopted a more proactive posture toward Asia. And a particular important departure was the stepping up of military exchanges with its neighbors to reduce distrust and anxiety toward its rise. However, as we all know, it takes two to tango. The changes in China's grand strategy toward Asia only partly explains the changes in the security cooperation patterns. If other regional countries don't place high value on cooperation with China, then we would not observe increasing inclusion of China in joint military exercises in the region. Then what made China an attractive partner of security cooperation for Asian countries? In the second part of my project, I argue that there is a spillover effect of cooperation from one domain to another in Asia. I believe that slowly but steadily, the area of cooperation with China broadened from low politics to high politics through three phases. To elaborate, successful diplomatic normalization between China and the Asia-Pacific countries from 1970s to 1990s enabled the expansion of trade and economic exchanges with China in the 2000s, and this ultimately created momentum and incentive for security cooperation with China in the past 2 decades. I mentioned briefly in my talk earlier, but I would like to highlight how much China is integrated with the region in terms of economy and people-to-people exchange today. As you can see from the table, China is the largest trading partner and largest source of foreign tourists for most of the Asia-Pacific countries after the 2000s. So for example, China is the largest trading partner of South Korea since 2004 and largest source of foreign tourists since 2013. And for Asean, the largest trading partner since 2009 and the largest tourist partner since 2016. Indeed, tensions are not absent in the region. However, I believe that under such high economic integration with China, security cooperation has become much more profitable and attractive in comparison to violent option for regional countries. To have a better understanding of regional countries' motivations and logics for holding joint military exercise with China, I gathered and conducted case study on the remarks made by high government officials and military officers in their public statements and interviews. As an illustrative example, in today's talk, I would like to talk about the 2018 China-ASEAN Maritime exercise. To provide a bit of background on the exercise, in the middle of increasing salience of maritime dispute in the South China Sea, China and ASEAN held large-scale maritime exercise in the waters near Zhangjian. This exercise was noteworthy in the sense that it was the first exercise that the ASEAN has conducted as a whole with a single country, even before doing one with the United States. The exercise was participated by 8 Navy ships, 3 helicopters, and more than 1,200 military personnel from China and 10 member states of the ASEAN. Moreover, the exercise was notable because countries such as Brunei, Vietnam, and Philippines, the countries who have competing territorial claim with China in the South China Sea, also sent their neighbor vessel to practice the code for unplanned encounters at sea. So, sharing some of my findings in the case study, I would like to share some of the selected comments made by the Southeast Asian leaders. And I'd like to start by sharing the statement made by the Singaporean officials who co-hosted the exercise with China. At the opening ceremony of the 2018 exercise, Singapore Chief Navy Rear Admiral Lu Chong-hong emphasized the need to enhance cooperation and reduce the risk of miscalculation with China because continued prosperity in the region could be possible only if the sea is stable and secure. Also proposing the regularization of the exercise with China, Singapore Defense Minister Ang Heng said, the way forward for ASEAN-China maritime exercise is to have more of them and larger ones so that the confidence can be built between them. He also highlighted, it's always better that you have exercise together, looking at each other eye to eye, better than sitting across the table with cross purposes. And I believe that this is the sentiment that is shared by other leaders in the region as well. In November 2019, when asked whether maritime exercise with China would become an annual event, the Malaysian Defense Minister Muhammad Sabu expressed his support to the idea and noted the joint naval exercise is another effort by ASEAN and China to ensure peace and stability in the region. Furthermore, asserting that the overlapping claim on the South China Sea should not be the totality of the Philippines' relationship with China, the Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte said, Philippines wants to talk about cooperation, and most of all, Philippines wants to talk about business with China, because war would lead them to nowhere. To conclude, then what did I tell you today? Today in my talk, I have demonstrated that security cooperation ties in the Asia-Pacific have evolved over time. Shifting the lens from alliances to joint military exercises reveals new pattern of security cooperation in the region. The key finding of my research is that the US allies and strategic partners in the region engage in security cooperation not only with the United States, but also with China after the 2000s. Using remarks of the regional leaders and high military officials, I have showed you that spillover effect of cooperation from economic domain to security arena is driving this new development in Asia. Indeed, achieving cooperation in international relations is very difficult. However, as the case of Asia shows, and as Axelrod and Keoane have noted in their canonical discussion on cooperation, world politics is not a homogeneous state of war, and cooperation varies among issues and over time. It is because cooperation is not equivalent to harmony. Harmony may require complete identity of interest, but cooperation can take place in situations that contains a mixture of conflicting and complementary interest. And as Bob Jervis noted, especially this is the case when the gains from cooperations are high and the cost of non-cooperations are prohibitive for countries. Then what does the emergence of security cooperation network that embraces China mean for regional stability? Throughout the post-Cold War period, a group of scholars projected grim assessment on the prospects for peace on Asia. Pointing to the lack of linkages among states and recent memory of cooperation as the sources of instability, some scholars even said, for better and for worse, Europe's conflictual past could be Asia's future. However, does the proposition hold true for the Asia-Pacific in the 21st century? One reassuring conclusion of this research is that the cooperative security ties between states that were either absent or weak in the early 1990s are present and growing in the region today. Providing support to my argument that there is no Asia's paradox, the finding implies that security ties in the Asia-Pacific are not fragmented and it is interconnected as much as economic ties in the region. So that brings me to the end of my talk. And I believe and I hope, if I'm right, we can be a little bit more optimistic about the prospects for peace in Asia. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kyuri. Now, would you like to stop sharing screen? And that's great. And I'm going to invite participants, please, to reconnect your video function if you are able to do so, so that we can all see each other, and to create more of a group discussion feel. You may also want to enable the gallery view function on your Zoom interface that will allow you to see as many people as possible individually. Thank you very much, Kyuri, for a really sort of organized and a fun presentation. And I think everyone agrees that the visualization, particularly that you offered of your network dataset changes over time, was very, very effective. But I'll let people say that themselves. I've got a number of indications of responses and questions. And before we get there, I'd like to just take the chair's prerogative to make a short comment. You know, I think this is a fascinating study, and in many ways really, really important, and sets us on a corrective path in a number of ways, as you've quite rightly already indicated. And you've very cleverly, of course, pegged this study to some of the big questions currently being debated in Asia-Pacific security more broadly. So I think that's a really nice move. I suppose, you know, even as I'm, you know, quite persuaded by the argument you're trying to make here, I guess this is a question that you get all the time, every time you give this presentation, right? And it's on that point of the significance, right, of taking into account this changing trend of military exercises, right? The multi-nodalizing, if you want to put it that way, of the security cooperation network in the region. I'm sure that you always get questions from detractors, essentially trying to say to you, this is all well and good and really interesting, but who cares, right? Military exercises are just military exercises. So essentially, there'll be all these variants of the questions that come back to the claim that you made at the beginning, right? That this is not just a cheap show, right? But that these are costly signals, right? So I guess I would push you a little bit on that, you know, to get a better sense of how would you convince us that these, you know, military exercises indeed constitute costly signaling, right? Or is there any way in which your data set and your case studies actually demonstrate the costliness of this signaling exercise? The second part, I guess, and I don't know that you'll have an answer at this point if you're still doing the second part of the question, which is the why part. But I think, you know, the answer to my question actually resides in the why part. In order to demonstrate that there's some significance to Asia-Pacific countries' decisions to increasingly enmesh China in security cooperation, the answers can only come from an understanding of motivations of why these countries have made these decisions to do these things and how they view the significance of doing these things, right? So I think the second part of your enterprise is a vital one to answering, you know, that I guess what must be the main question that always comes up for you in this project. So if you, again, I'm not expecting that you can give a very quick answer to this, but if there were any light that you can shed on that question, I think it will go some way towards answering some pretty common questions that you must get in response to this. Now, Kyuri, would you like to hold that and then let me get a couple of people to ask their questions, because a couple of people have questions that are related to what I've just brought up. Is that too much, or would you like to give a response first and then we go to the other questions?
I think it'll be awesome to collect some thoughts and like questions first, and then I'll try to answer them in a more like organized manner. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. In that case, I'm going to invite Manjit Singh Padesi, whose question I think kind of follows on to, in two questions follow on what I've just raised there. Manjit, are you happy to come in?
Yes, thank you, Evelyn, and thank you, Kyuri, for that very fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it, and the data as well as the visualization was fantastic, so thank you for that. I guess my questions are along the lines, along the points raised by Evelyn. I was wondering about the why question as well, the second question as to why there are more exercises with China. And I guess the way I see it, your hypothesis is that diplomatic cooperation leads to economic cooperation and eventually leads to security cooperation. I was looking at the data and the graphs that you had, and from around the 2000s or so, the US and China start exercising. And I was wondering how much of this is, at least as far as US allies like Australia, for example, arguably are concerned, how much of this is emulation of what the US itself is doing as opposed to something else? I guess my second question has to do with the nature of military exercises. And I'm not a quantitative person, so I might have gotten this wrong. So this is in part a query as to what the data represents, and in part also a substantive question, I guess. So like you mentioned that you have 40 years worth of data, and I was wondering, do you code all military exercises as one military exercise in terms of your density, in terms of transitivity, and so on? But that I mean, if Singapore, for example, is engaging in an HADR kind of exercise with China, is that one equivalent to an anti-submarine warfare exercise with the United States? So in that sense, is China's increasing centrality, and I'm convinced that China is being enmeshed, but maybe China's increasing centrality can perhaps be qualified, and perhaps some variation be shown between, say, the way Vietnam conducts exercises with China compared to Philippines, compared to Singapore, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Professor Kyuri, could I just take the opportunity to log roll some of the other questions into Manjit's point about, tell me if I'm getting you wrong, Manjit, but I think, you know, one of your important points was this issue of how do we code the military exercises? Are all military exercises treated as the same, right? And there's variations of this question in many people's questions in the chat box, you know, questions coming from Amir, from Tom, from Junyan, from Sarah. They're all asking variations of that question. Sarah's question, for example, is there a difference between multilateral versus bilateral exercises? Any difference in how you code them, or just significance? You know, others asked about whether you gauge a difference between tabletop exercises and other forms, which is a variation of Manjit's question, and so on. So perhaps you could address that coding issue.
Okay. So should I answer?
Yeah, but before we lose the trend, you know, train of thought on that.
Yeah, got it. So yes, that's one part I'm really working on right now. So after collecting the data set, I'm disaggregating the data and classifying it by the types of exercises, but it's still work in progress. So in the part of, in my presentation today, I kind of shared the part of the classification that I've done, which is that by the types of exercise based on the military branch that this exercise is involved. So for instance, like today I shared you like how many % of the exercises involved the Navy. So that's one classification that I've done so far. And the harder task is actually classifying these exercises by type, because one thing that I noticed while doing coding for this exercise is that often this exercises has more than one purpose. Sometimes they have multiple purpose. Sometimes some part of the training involves combat exercise, but also it involves search and rescue. So that was the part I'm still struggling, but I do have the first cut of classification, and I'm happy to share the slide later through the like screen sharing to share what the disaggregation of the data looks like in the preliminary stages. And also, yeah, based on that, and on that note, yes, in terms of my analysis, I haven't done the analysis based on these types of exercises. So I have not weighted these ties or weighted these exercises based on the type yet, but definitely that's the route that I want to pursue later once I'm done with the classification of the types of the exercises. But actually, given that the size of the data set, it's taking longer than what I've expected. And also, I'll show you with the screen sharing later, but in terms of the types of exercises that China conduct with these countries in the region, to be honest, yes, it's not really a combat exercise. It's different from those exercises that United States does with the allies. Most of the exercises are military operations other than war. For instance, a lot of exercises that involve like search and rescue, or like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also perhaps some non-traditional security cooperation issues such as counterterrorism or anti-piracy. So as you can see, it's not like warfare or war simulation game that China is doing with these countries. But then I still felt like these exercises do mean something for the region, because especially given that China and the regional countries are having tension in the maritime domain over borders, and there's such high possibility of miscalculation. But then by doing this kind of exercises, I thought that these countries can build trust and also reduce the chances of miscalculation. So although it is search and rescue exercise, the fact that the navies are meeting together could have some significance for the region, for the Asia Pacific, I thought. Yeah, but it's something that I have to hone more and look into more so that I can make an argument here. Yeah.
Thanks, Kyuri.
Yeah,
sorry, Kyuri, go on.
Yeah, can I actually also respond on Manjit's point on can the behavior of the regional countries just be an emulation of the US-China new development in security cooperation? And yes, I think to a certain extent that can be another explanation, because as we all know, if the United States completely disapproves or doesn't like the idea of the allies like kind of hanging out with China, I think this wouldn't have been possible at all. And to a certain extent, because the United States also invited China to many of the multilateral exercises, we were able to see increasing number of China's participation in joint military exercise in the region. And for instance, one example is China's participation in RIMPAC in the after the 2010s, right? So first of all, China started as an observer upon the invitation of the United States, and later it became a like official participants. Still, I mean, China is not participating all parts of the RIMPAC exercise, but also the fact that China is invited to the exercise also holds the significance. So I think, Manja, you do have a point there. This new development in the region can be partly can be attributed to the development in China and United States relations. Yeah.
Thanks, Kyuri. I think you've opened up, a number of avenues that we could go down, and we've got lots of questions. I'm going to give, just so we can open this up a bit, but also deepen it into the question of case selection still. I'm going to give Catherine Reed a chance to ask her 2 questions, because I think that will help us to bring this conversation forward. Catherine, is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, by the way, guys, if you'd like to briefly introduce yourselves, that would be quite helpful, because maybe not everyone knows us. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Delaware. I'm currently in Cambodia on a Fulbright. I had 2 questions. One was related to case selection. I was wondering, in your presentation, you mentioned, I think that you were including like the major countries of the region. I also read your paper and I didn't see as much explanation of maybe why you selected some of the cases. So I was wondering why, for example, you excluded Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, whether that it's because they're smaller countries in the case of Laos and Cambodia. Particularly for Cambodia, Cambodia has held joint military exercises in recent years with both US and China. They've broken off exercises with the United States. So I was wondering whether, why maybe you excluded Cambodia, if there was a reason. And then secondly, I was wondering, I thought, at least in your paper for your 2 case studies, I think both of them are related to naval or maritime exercises. So I thought maybe it would also be useful to have a qualitative case study that's not a naval exercise, just to see, maybe to develop your link, since you're trying to develop a link between kind of these three phases and the economic interdependence leading to security cooperation. And I was wondering also how specifically you can distinguish in the case studies that you do have, since they seem to be very much about the South China Sea, how you can distinguish between like the hard security concerns related to the South China Sea and the kind of more economic security or an energy security concerns. So that was a lot of talking, but really interesting project.
Thanks, Catherine. Kyuri, do you want to respond briefly?
Yeah, I think.
Or would you like me to collate some more?
Yeah, before I lose all the answers that I came up with. So yes, in terms of the why those 11 countries are major countries and why no Laos or Cambodia or Myanmar in my case, or in my like data set. So being very honest here, is like just having the data, getting the data collected for 11 countries itself was a lot of work. So I had to make the choice. I had to start with a small number of countries, and then I thought that a good number of countries in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and also the countries that is US ally, non-US ally, I was trying to create some balance, and that's why I ended up not being able to include a few other countries that is also in the region and also part of ASEAN. But then as I like move forward with the project, I definitely feel like, yes, when I say this is a pattern in the Asia Pacific, I should also have, it'll be nice to have data points on other countries. And as you pointed out, Catherine, about Cambodia, like, even though I was not trying to collect data, but like, while I was reading up, and like I ended up also collecting some data points on Cambodia. And yes, Cambodia is a very interesting case, because around 2016 or 2017, actually Cambodia decided not to have a joint military exercise with the United States, saying that, oh, we have this domestic election and we don't have enough money, so we're not going to do exercise. But then surprise, ta-da, like they do exercise with China next year. So I felt like, oh, that's really interesting case. Cambodia might be making some interesting decisions there. So as you pointed out, maybe I might find some interesting things if I look into other case studies that is not South China Sea and more land based. So yes, it'll be awesome to explore other cases too. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kyuri. I'm going to turn to Rohan Mukherjee, and who has two questions, I think, which will again help us to move this discussion along a little bit. Rohan, are you happy to ask them?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Hi, Kyuri. I'm Rohan Mukherjee. I teach at Yale and US College. I really like the work that you've done. It reminded me of two sort of unrelated literatures that I read before, which is about confidence building measures between rivals on the one hand, and peacekeeping actually on the other, which is another interesting thing. And to me, both these literatures suggest that states might engage in security cooperation with a rival to signal all kinds of things, right? Well, peaceful intentions by revealing information about their capabilities, or they might do it to like learn about a rival's capabilities, or in the peacekeeping case, they do it to keep their militaries trained, right? And even the US and Soviet Union exchange information on nuclear weapons for these purposes during the Cold War. So these types of cooperation take place even in the absence of diplomatic and economic relations. And I'm just curious how your work would relate to that, and why you think that economics is what's driving this, whereas is this a story about a formerly isolated China that's sort of integrating into an order where you don't really need the economic story, it's just being so, you can have a sort of Johnstonian story of socialization as well. Going back a little bit to Manjeet's point about emulation. The other thing was about the methodology of process tracing in interviews and so on. So I would encourage, I mean, I think this is obviously the first cut, right? You have more chapters that look into the process. And so I guess specifying what the variables are, how they change, what the confounding factors would be in the cases, because I got a sense it was a collection of media quotes. And again, those sources can be very biased, especially when they're coming out of state sources. So just to nail down the causal mechanism, I guess, is what I'm driving at in this, because you have a really convincing data picture. We just need to know why it's happening, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Should I respond right away, Professor Go?
if you want.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Rowan, for sharing your thoughts and also like pointing at some of the literatures that I can look into. And especially, I want to start by answering some of the last point that you mentioned. Yeah, definitely my effort to answer the why question is still in process, and it's in quite early stages, I should say. And the case study that I have presented today and that is present in my paper is more of a like hypothesis like generating like case study. It was more of a pilot case study, and I do take your point that I should be more explicit about hypothesis. And with like cleared out hypothesis, actually I want to do some field work and do real interviews with the experts in the field, like those officers who have participated in the exercises. Because I think the case study that I've done here, like it's based on the public statement and interview quotes that I pulled from newspaper articles, and I don't think that's enough, right? But then I think that does the job of just illustrating the case and giving me some idea for hypothesis generation. But if I were to be more rigorous, I think I'll benefit more by interviewing the real officials. Yeah. And yes, you mentioned that maybe I don't need the economic story in the variable. Perhaps the reason why I came up with this conclusion is because I looked into the case of China and ASEAN and South China Sea. Probably that's why, based on the quotes that I pulled out, I came down to the conclusion that economic factor is driving the story. But perhaps as I look into the other confidence building and peace building literature, I might be able to run into other pathways or causal mechanisms for the phenomenon. Yeah, thank you for your suggestions there. Yeah.
So there are two threads here that would be useful just off of where Kyuri's just gone in her answers. One is that economic variable issue. There are two observations from Amir Zasalandra in the chat box, and also from Catherine Reed again on, the Cambodia example and how that may raise questions about confounding variables that have to do with economic factors, but not in the way you mean. So for instance, they've suggested this question of, whether China pays for military exercises, right, in one way or another. In some of these cases, and they've suggested that this may be relevant in the case of Cambodia and to some extent perhaps Malaysia as well, and that eases the ability of these countries or the willingness of these countries to undertake those military exercises. That's one direction in which some of the comments have gone, and I think even beyond these particular cases, I guess where these comments are pushing you towards is to urge you to think sort of more contextually and more fully within the country cases, right? And as you develop the qualitative part of your analysis. I think the second thread that is quite interesting is this question about CBMs or CSBMs in general. And I'm going to turn to Peter Lee because he's got, I think, again, two questions that really have to do with that issue of reference points and how do you code security cooperation. But Peter, I'll let you ask your questions yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Viola. Kyuri, lovely to finally meet you, at least virtually. Let me just start by saying I think it's an exciting and very timely project. If this is your first time dealing with Australians, hopefully we're more supportive and constructive than some of the destructive American conferences that I see. I think it's a fascinating topic just because my own research and my recently finished PhD was on why don't US allies cooperate with each other more? And I think yours is flipping that question of why do they cooperate with China? So I think it's an important topic, great puzzle. Choosing a least likely case is fascinating. I love your methodology. It's the conclusion I reached at the end of my thesis. I said somebody needs to do this with network analysis. So I love that. And I think the functionalist logic is really appealing. And that was the conclusion that I reached, that a lot of this is not strategically driven so much as built up through other interactions and factors. So that's my sort of supportive starting point. I think my two questions, and I think a lot of people have touched on it. The first one is, if you look at a lot of literature, especially produced by like CSCAP over the last 30 years. And they sort of have done so much work on this idea of confidence building measures, of sort of gradations over time of how we build a more interactive and cooperative region. And I think that's a very useful literature for your topic, just because maybe it's not about China. Maybe it's about Vietnam, Russia, and basically that sort of long process over the 1990s and 2000s where everybody was trying to build closer relations. And it started with dialogues and visits and mutual training and bringing officers. And then it sort of gradually led up to, low levels of activities, but we never reached the higher levels of, sort of sovereignty, sort of impinging activities. And that leads to that second point, I guess, I think everyone sort of touched on this issue, right? Is joint military exercises, bilateral or multilateral, actually a useful proxy for security cooperation as a much bigger question? And it's something that I grappled with my research, and I'm happy to have a chat about this in the coming weeks and months and years in terms of how we can approach this. But I think, at least I found that military exercises are very sort of low-hanging fruit in some senses. And it depends on how you code that, which is, I guess, what everybody's talking about. And I would say sort of, it depends on the purpose of the exercise, which I think you've already touched on, right? If it's a humanitarian assistance one, it's very different to planning to fight North Korea. The domain, right? I think everyone's touched on this, right? Naval exercises, much easier because navies tend to have extra slack. They can send a ship somewhere and do stuff, right? It takes a lot more effort and time and money to send 1,000 Singaporean soldiers to northern Queensland for a month to train. Similarly, the number of actors is quite interesting, I think. It actually starts quite easy with having many different countries like in RIMPAC, but then it gets much harder when two countries decide, okay, we're going to commit to this particular naval exercise every 2 years for the next 20 years. And I think similarly, the intensity. So whether you have one ship and 20 people compared to 20,000 soldiers, every year, it reflects very different types of military exercises. So I think those are sort of 4 areas where I think like the purpose, the domain, how many actors you have, the intensity of that might reflect different pictures of where the joint military exercise story shows. But having said that, I think, like you said, the fact that they even engage China militarily is a fascinating story that we need to really sort of unpack. So those are sort of my 2 big ideas. Evelyn, back to you.
Thanks, Peter. Very, very useful. Kyuri, did you want to sort of note that and think about it, or was there something you wanted to say in response at this juncture?
I felt like it was a question, but more of like thought-provoking suggestions here today. So Peter, I might have to follow with you on this, like after thinking about it a little bit more. But yeah, maybe like one thing that I agree is that like today in my talk, I framed it as like China's increasing joint military exercise with the region, because that was like most interesting finding that I found as a result of my like research. But then I agree with you that this is a general pattern in the region, and like as I demonstrated on the network itself, like we see increasing security cooperation between the allies and also the strategic partners. So as you touched in your own like dissertation, yes, like there were like joint military exercises between South Korea and Australia, and also like South Korea and the Southeast Asian countries, things like that. So as you noted, maybe China, the phenomenon of China might be just part of the bigger trend that is going on in the Asia Pacific. And I agree in that. But then, like people like to hear about China. And then I felt like that's the most interesting finding of the day for my research. So that's why my presentation was shaped around it. But I agree on that point of bigger trend going in the region. And I will have to think about whether a joint military exercise is a good proxy or not, but yes. And especially the part that you mentioned, I also got that feedback from others, whether naval exercise, is it naval exercise really a costly one comparing to land exercise? I will have to disagree on that a little, because like, even if it's easy to dispatch ships, I feel like just like having exercise in this the area of big tension and like conflict itself has so much significance. And the fact that, I mean, the reason why I feel like we see a lot of naval exercises in the region is not because this is cheap, but because these countries share a lot of maritime borders. Think about it, like all the countries in Asia are actually sharing the maritime area, whereas not all the countries are sharing the borders, right? So I think it's just the geographical like characteristics of Asia that makes us to see more neighbor exercise, not because it's cheap. So I might have to push back a little bit on that, but yeah, I'm happy to talk about whether it's a good proxy or not a little more like in another like conversation. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Kyuri. I'm going to turn to Brendan Sargent in a moment for his remarks, which we can see in the chat box. And I think just to add the context to that and the bridge here, I think bridging between where Peter's come from and where Brendan's going to go, I think it's a case of, you know, because of your topic, you are subject to tensions from two quite different lenses on this, right? The contemporary, especially American lens, is one that reflexively views all of this through the US-China rivalry. Okay, it's a reflexive thing. And so you get to where you've kind of tried to go to. For others of us who have looked at security cooperation as a subject in itself in the Asia Pacific, particularly those of us who looked at Southeast Asia for the last 20 to 30 years, you know, that US-China rivalry lens is not the reflexive one. And the reflexive lens is much more one about security cooperation in the region and things like confidence building, right? So I think even if you decide to adopt, you know, the US-China rivalry lens, it's still really, really important to know that there are these two lenses, and how are you going to sort of recognize that it leads you to very different methodologies depending on which lens you adopt. And it also skews how you code your data depending on which lens you adopt. This is the important point I think that's come out of the discussion. It does skew how you code your data, right? So just going to put that to you first, and then turn to Brendan Sargent. Sorry, Brendan, for prefacing you, and I hope I haven't sort of cornered you into something.
No, not at all. It's a really interesting project that you're doing, and I really like the central proposition that there's you know, less difference between the economic order and the security order than people would think if they only look at it through the lens of US-China. Look, so I'll talk so I'm the head of SDSC, but I used to work in the Department of Defense, did a lot of work on this sort of area. And two comments, in the ASEAN forums, Defense Ministers forums, there's a lot of emphasis on cooperation in order to build capacity for future crises. And the crises are not US-China rivalry. They're things that happen in the region, you know, and primarily HADR, counterterrorism, that sort of stuff. And they're relatively easy to work on because they're real and they're practical problems and they're things that people can agree on. And one of the things that the ASEAN forums are careful to do is not put too much policy loading on the, you know, the development of cooperative activities, because once you say it's to build warfighting capability, then it becomes much harder. And so, you know, to me, what you're talking about is very consistent with policy trends in the region as a whole. And it might be worth looking at what some of the forums actually talk about in that context. But the point I wanted to make was occasionally cooperation really speeds up when there's a crisis. So three things that occur to me. One is when the Malaysian plane crashed in the Indian Ocean, primarily with Chinese people on board, the Chinese deployed to try and search for the plane. It was a big exercise for them. They learned a lot. And Australia helped them a lot in terms of logistics, support, command and control support, and so on. So the capacity of our ability to work with China went up significantly in response to that. But we'd already had links with China, so we're able to establish that. So the pre-existing exercises, you know, functioned as a sort of investment. The second example is when you had the tsunami in Aceh with Indonesia. Once again, the level of cooperation went up because it was in response to a crisis, but the capacity had been built through the exercises and activity over a very long period of time with Indonesia. But other countries also engaged in that as well. And then the third one is the Mirari Crisis in 2017, where the ASEANs engaged in levels of military cooperation which we hadn't seen before, because the crisis was more significant. The need to respond to the crisis was more significant than the policy considerations which would limit their cooperation in normal circumstances. So to me, that was, it might be worth, as you go forward with this, just to have a think about some of the crises that have occurred and how the crisis advances the capability for cooperation that didn't previously exist for policy or whatever other reason. And I think in a future, if there's a significant crisis in the region that's not associated with things like warfare or Taiwan or whatever, you would see the Americans and the Chinese cooperate at pretty high levels in order to resolve it, and then slip back to what they normally do once it's over.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Kyuri, in a minute or so, I'm going to turn over to you for some, final remarks that you may want to make. But just to reassure you in the meantime that my colleague Kian will make sure that you get a copy of the questions and comments that have been posted in the chat box after this. So yeah, really, don't worry. So you will get a copy of that, and I'm sure that those of us who put in comments and questions there would also be happy to follow up with you if you like, separately via email, etc. Very happy to facilitate that. But I'm going to give you a chance to respond either to Brendan's suggestions or to anything else that has come up in the discussion so far in the final couple of minutes before I call this seminar to a close. I think it's fair that I give you a chance to respond if there was anything else you wanted to. Okay.
Yeah, so I'll just conclude by responding to Brendan and maybe sharing one example that came up to my mind. So thank you, Brendan, for directing my attention to this crisis. And I think I should definitely look into it, and it'll be a golden cases for further case studies. And while you're saying this, it made me think maybe many of the security cooperation in the region is in part driven by crisis, maybe it's event driven. And I think it's not really different from some of the discussions in the existing literature. I noticed that some authors argue that a lot of cooperation in Asia is actually event driven. It is not pre-planned, but when there is a crisis or when there is an event, they gather and try to develop these capabilities. And the problem is it doesn't really get ritualized or get sticky, but still they earn some capability through this experience. So yes, maybe I can pull in some event-driven story in my causal mechanisms perhaps, and I'll try to look into these cases closely. And one thing that I want to share is that one fun fact is that while preparing for the presentation, I was thinking about what are the potential questions that I might get. And in the US audience, the question that I often get is then how is it different from Europe? And do you see this kind of development in other regions as well? And one example that I want to share is that I felt like this new trend that is going on in Asia is very interesting because this is not something that we see in Europe. So when I say Europe is that, so it's a similar diet. So let's say China and China's relations with regional countries may be a little bit similar to Russia's relations with European countries, the NATO countries. But the one interesting thing is that there is no exercise between NATO and Russia. And then recently they had one exercise in a decade. But then that's really different from the story that we see here in China and the regional countries. So on that note, I felt to a certain extent, maybe we can be more hopeful about the degree of cooperation in Asia than many Europeans or the Westerners think about. So that's the last fun fact that I wanted to share, that maybe Asia is more cooperative. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that we can sort of end on that slightly more optimistic note, unlike most of our usual discussions about regional security. But listen, Kyuri, thank you so much for generously sharing your research with us. I know this can be a difficult thing to do at, at the advanced stages of a PhD, and so we were delighted when you were willing to do this. This is great, and this is part of the purpose of the seminar series. It is to showcase work at different stages, and from scholars who are at different stages of their career as well. And to everyone else who has taken time to join us, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules. It is a difficult time for everybody. Let me thank you for your generous suggestions and comments as well on Kyuri's behalf. It only remains for me to remind you that you will be able to find the short reading recommendations and also eventually the recording of this event on our website, which you have the link to in the chat box. And our last seminar in this series will take place on the 20th of October. And Maria Tanyak, who was here with us earlier in this session, will be the speaker for that last seminar on the 20th of October. The advertising will go out for that very shortly. Thank you so much, everyone. And it's a pleasure to see you all again. And please feel free to hang out for a couple of minutes if you'd like to just have an informal chat, and don't mind everyone else listening to you. Take care, and I will see you again next time. Thank you so much, everyone. And the recording stops now.